Hey guys, tonight we are going to stroll together into the powdered, perfumed, and yes, slightly pastry-scented world of Georgian wigs. Imagine narrow cobblestone streets lit by flickering oil lamps, horses clopping lazily through the fog, and men strutting around in headgear so tall and frosted with white dust that you could almost mistake them for tiered cakes on legs. Women, of course, joined in too, their coiffures soaring toward the heavens, stuffed with ribbons, feathers, and the occasional decorative ship. You probably wouldn't survive a single morning in this era of elaborate hair rituals and starch-clouded parlours. Not because of the fashion police, but because breathing in clouds of scented powder daily was practically an Olympic sport for your lungs. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you do, drop a comment telling me your location and the local time right now. I love knowing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking into early 18th century London, and wigs are no longer just practical covers for bald spots or lice outbreaks. They are a cultural explosion. Everyone who's anyone is wearing one, and the size of your wig isn't just vanity. It's a declaration of your place in society. Imagine a courtroom where judges sit like towering confectionery displays, their wigs cascading in curls like endless meringue. Picture ballrooms shimmering with candlelight, powdered hair catching the glow and giving everyone's head the faint sheen of frosted buns. The mainstream fact here is simple. Wigs became a fashion necessity after King Louis XIV of France popularized them in the late 1600s. The Sun King, balding early, decided to mask his thinning scalp with extravagant hairpieces, and naturally, courtiers copied him. Across Europe, this trend became a tidal wave, reaching the Georgian period where wigs grew ever taller, whiter, and yes, fragrantly strange. But the quirky tidbit lies in how ordinary folks viewed this craze. If you were a servant or a shopkeeper, seeing a powdered wig walk by was like catching a whiff of bakery air mixed with chalk dust. People sometimes joked that you could sniff out a lord before you saw him, thanks to the perfumed starch wafting ahead. Wigs weren't just visual spectacles, they were scented events. Of course, historians still argue whether this wig obsession was born purely from fashion or partly from necessity. Was it about hiding lice, protecting against the soot and grime of industrial cities, or just about flexing wealth? Some scholars say wigs functioned as wearable hygiene shields. Others say that's nonsense, pointing instead to the sheer delight aristocrats took in outwigging each other. As you trudge along Fleet Street, imagine powdered wig shops glowing like modern hair salons. In the windows, rows of curls hang on stands, awaiting buyers. Inside, wig makers puff clouds of starch onto their creations, a process that probably leaves their apprentices coughing like chimney sweeps. Customers argue over which scent should accompany their new headpiece. Lavender for subtlety, cinnamon for flair, or orange blossom for daring extravagance. And here's your first gentle joke for tonight. You know you've reached peak fashion when your head smells like a dessert tray, but you're still expected to act dignified in Parliament. One poor MP was mocked because every time he bowed, his wig left behind the faint aroma of almond cookies, leading colleagues to call him the walking bakery. The wigs didn't just rest on heads, they practically defined Georgian identity. To wear one meant you belonged to the modern world, tuned to sophistication, commerce, and politics. To not wear one, especially if you were wealthy, suggested stubbornness or scandal. Even artists painting portraits often exaggerated wig size to emphasize their subject's grandeur. Think about the sensory overload, the sound of horse hooves mixing with harpsichords from taverns, the taste of sugared almonds on your tongue, and the constant itch of starch dust sneaking into your collar. Your nose picks up the mingled perfumes, some sweet, some cloying, some just odd. And as you shuffle through the crowd, everyone's headgear looks more like the dessert table at a wedding reception than actual hair. Still, practicality lurked beneath all that frosting. Powder helped keep wigs looking clean and absorb oils. Without it, wigs would have quickly turned greasy under London's soot-filled skies. But with it, they gleamed like snowy hills, smelling faintly of pastries. By now, you realize Georgian life was a parade of contradictions. Luxury paired with discomfort, elegance with absurdity, dignity with the faint possibility of sneezing yourself bald from all that powder. Yet people embraced it fully because appearance mattered more than convenience. As the carriages roll past and powdered heads bob through the lamplight, you can almost taste sugar in the air. This isn't just history, it's sensory theatre, a performance where even your hair becomes a pastry shop display. And tonight, you're drifting into that world, where fashion is fragrant, wigs are towering, and everyone secretly wonders if they look more like a duke or a frosted cupcake. You keep walking through those Georgian streets, and now the wigs begin to reveal their secret ingredients. Powder wasn't just powder, it was a peculiar blend of starches, ground finely until they looked like snowfall trapped in little wooden boxes. The most common base, wheat or rice flour. And here's the fun part, bakers were furious. Imagine being a baker in 18th century London, already struggling with rising grain prices, and then watching aristocrats dump precious flour onto their wigs instead of their bread. People muttered that nobles cared more about fluffy curls than hungry bellies. That's the mainstream fact here. Flour-based wig powder was so popular that governments taxed it. In Britain, the infamous hair powder tax of 1795 required men to pay an annual fee just to sprinkle their wigs white. If you refused, you risked looking outdated, or even being mocked as natural. It was the powdered versus unpowdered version of today's iPhone wars. The quirky tidbit lies in the scents. Wig powder didn't stop at flour. It was mixed with perfumes, and these could get wildly creative. Orange blossom, lavender, and rose were common, but sometimes wig makers experimented with nutmeg, cinnamon, or even vanilla. That's how wigs ended up smelling like pastries. Imagine leaning in to whisper court gossip, only to make your companion crave a cinnamon bun. It was a fashion choice and a snack hazard all in one. Historians still argue whether these sweet scents were meant primarily for charm or to mask something less appealing. Wigs, after all, were prone to collecting sweat, soot, and whatever else London air carried. Was perfume powder simply about delight, or was it a desperate cover-up for questionable hygiene? Scholars haven't agreed, and maybe they never will. Picture the process. You sit stiffly in a wig maker's chair. An assistant shakes powder from a puff like a snowstorm falling directly onto your head. The scent fills the room, floral, spicy, slightly sugary. Powder clings to curls, coats your collar, and drifts into your lap until you resemble both a duke and a dessert. You cough, blink, and pretend to enjoy it because fashion is supposed to hurt, or at least irritate the lungs. Here's a gentle joke for you. If you lived back then, you could probably skip dessert at the banquet. Just lean forward and sniff your neighbor's wig. Instant calorie-free cake. Yet wig powder wasn't just for show. It helped whiten hair, which in Georgian culture symbolized refinement and dignity. White hair suggested wisdom and age, but conveniently without the actual aches of old age. A powdered head declared, "I'm respectable, I'm cultured, and I probably own 3 country estates." The downside? Powder was messy. Servants often complained about having to dust furniture daily because masters walked around shedding starch like dandruff from heaven. Whole rooms could smell like bakeries after a single grooming session. One diary entry even mentions clouds so thick that candles burned blue. But here's the strange fringe fact. Wig powders could attract pests. Mice were said to nibble on wigs left unattended, lured by the flower and sweet perfumes. This is partly why wigs were stored on stands and covered with silk at night. Nobody wanted to wake up and discover a rodent had turned their fashion piece into dinner. As you picture this, imagine yourself leaving the wig maker's shop. The London fog swirls outside, and now your head smells like spiced cake. Passers-by glance at you, not out of respect, but because your curls release little flower puffs with every step, trailing you like a sugary comet. Children giggle, and one baker shakes his fist, muttering about wasted bread. Meanwhile, debates about wigs reached the newspapers. Pamphlets mocked powdered nobles as walking pastries. Satirical cartoons showed men's heads as frosted buns with cherries on top. Fashion, of course, survived mockery. People kept powdering anyway because nothing says power like strolling into a ballroom smelling faintly of vanilla muffins. And here's another joke to tuck you in. You know your fashion has gone too far when strangers debate whether to eat your hairstyle with a fork. The whole scene is absurdly cozy. Powder falling like snow, curls bouncing, and the faint aroma of desserts drifting through candlelit halls. You keep walking, breathing in sugar-scented air, trying not to sneeze. This is Georgian England, where heads weren't just heads. They were frosted, fragrant monuments to vanity and power. You stroll deeper into Georgian society. And soon you realize wigs weren't simply wigs. They were towering architectural feats balanced on fragile necks. These creations could rise a foot or more above someone's head, sculpted with curls, loops, and ribbons, until the wearer looked like a walking tiered cake. You thought modern skyscrapers were impressive. Imagine trying to sip tea with 3 pounds of hair and powder swaying above your teacup. The mainstream historical fact here is that such wigs, called perukes, were especially popular among judges, lawyers, and politicians. They weren't just fashion statements. They were uniforms of authority. Walk into a courtroom without one, and you risked being seen as unserious. Even today, British judges still cling to wig traditions, though thankfully in more manageable sizes. But here comes the quirky tidbit. Some wigs had accessories built right in. Ribbons, faux flowers, tiny birds, even fruit replicas were wired into the curls. Yes, fruit. There are records of ladies swaying into the opera with grapes and cherries bobbing beside their powdered temples. It's the 18th century version of walking around with plastic sushi keychains dangling from your AirPods. Historians still argue whether these extravagant flourishes were meant to impress or simply to outdo rivals. Was it about artful beauty, or was it one giant "my wig is taller than your wig" contest? We may never know, but the effect was unmistakable. Heads became conversation starters, gossip magnets, and occasionally architectural hazards. Now imagine yourself entering a ballroom. Candles glow, violins hum, and suddenly you notice the air shimmering, not with romance, but with clouds of powder. Every twirl of a dancer releases puffs of starch into the atmosphere, until the chandeliers seem wrapped in mist. It smells faintly of roses and cinnamon, like someone spilled a bakery across the parquet floor. Here's a joke to lighten the mood. Georgian balls were probably the only time in history when you could sneeze and accidentally ruin 3 people's hairstyles in one blast. But practicality lurked beneath the glamour. Wigs doubled as social masks. They hid baldness, lice, or hair that hadn't seen soap in weeks. For men, a wig suggested control and sophistication. For women, it screamed elegance and desirability. It was less about vanity and more about signaling status, like today's limited edition sneakers, except they perched heavily on your skull. One fringe fact for you. Some wig makers experimented with stiffening agents like beef marrow or lard before powdering. The smell, especially on warm evenings, wasn't exactly Chanel No. 5. That's another reason perfumed powders became essential. They had to cover up the underlying whiff of stew. As you drift further into the scene, think about the logistics. Servants had to carry wig boxes the size of small coffins. Carriages were sometimes adjusted so heads could fit without bumping ceilings. One letter even describes a lady leaning sideways for an entire ride because her wig wouldn't fit upright. Fashion demanded sacrifice, and vertebrae were the first to go. There's a gentle comedy in the sheer absurdity of it all. You picture yourself sitting at supper, head tilted just to sip broth without dipping curls into gravy. Across the table, someone else is trying not to ignite their wig powder on a stray candle flame. It's less dinner, more obstacle course, yet people adored it. The ritual of donning a wig, powdering it, and stepping into society gave a thrill of transformation. You weren't merely yourself anymore. You were a confection, a spectacle, a frosted beacon of wealth. In a world without Instagram, your wig was your profile picture, constantly refreshed with powder. And for the second joke, you could say Georgian wigs had their own kind of Wi-Fi signal. The taller the tower, the stronger the connection to gossip. The debates of the day rumbled on. Some pamphlets denounced wigs as foreign, French-inspired nonsense. Others defended them as symbols of civilization. Parliament even taxed powder, not only to raise money, but to subtly discourage excessive display. Yet the elite continued, turning every banquet into a bakery-scented pageant. So you keep walking, eyes half drowsy now, through a haze of powder, perfumes, and laughter. Somewhere, a violin plays. Somewhere else, someone sneezes, and half a table disappears in a sugar-white puff. And you think to yourself, in the Georgian era, no head was just a head. It was pastry, perfume, and prestige, stacked into one improbable tower. You shuffle onward into the powder-clouded haze, and here the story turns practical. Because underneath all the ribbons, curls, and perfume, these wigs needed one thing above all else: stability. Imagine spending hours teasing and stacking hair into loops, only to have the whole tower collapse like a souffle at the faintest wobble. Georgian wig wearers learned quickly, without a strong base, you weren't going to survive a single dance. The mainstream historical fact is that wigs were anchored with stiff pads, horsehair stuffing, and sometimes even wire cages hidden inside. Yes, cages. Think of it as scaffolding for hair, keeping curls from sagging and making sure the grand silhouette stayed perfectly poised all evening. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some ambitious wearers secretly used pieces of bread dough or pastry paste as temporary padding. Baked goods, tucked under curls, gave just enough structure to hold the shape, which means, in some ballrooms, you weren't just smelling powder and perfume. You might have been catching faint whiffs of freshly baked rolls wafting off someone's head. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or simply a rumour spread by satirists. Caricature artists of the 18th century adored mocking wigs, often exaggerating them into absurdity. But the fact remains, food and fashion had a stranger relationship back then than most of us could imagine. And here comes joke number 1. If you ever felt faint on the dance floor, you could just nibble on your wig stuffing, instant snack, zero shame. Your senses wander into the dressing chamber of a Georgian lady preparing for the theatre. Servants bustle, mixing starch and flour into powder, adjusting the towering wig piece by piece. They tilt her head back, sprinkle more powder, then tap the structure to make sure nothing wobbles. You hear the sharp clap of hands, the satisfied sigh when the wig sits firmly, like a pie cooling on a shelf. But don't think this was just vanity. Wigs carried political weight. During the 1770s, you could tell a man's political allegiance by the style of his wig. Short and neat for reformists, high and elaborate for conservatives. Your hairstyle was your bumper sticker, except instead of slapping it on your car, you balanced it above your eyes and hoped for the best in windy weather. Second joke, for good measure, Georgian politics must have been wild. You could literally spot your enemy across the street by measuring wig height. And then there's the fringe detail. Wigs sometimes required flour in such massive quantities that during food shortages, moralists scolded the wealthy for wasting bread on their heads while the poor went hungry. In 1795, riots broke out in Britain over food scarcity, and pamphlets viciously criticised powdered heads for making fashion out of flour when loaves were scarce. It wasn't just frivolous, it was seen as a symbol of class cruelty. Still, that didn't stop the elites. They powdered on, declaring that a head must smell as sweet as it looked. Perfumed oils of rose, lavender, or bergamot mingled with flour, masking the starchy odour. The result? Crowded theatres where the air smelled like someone opened a bakery inside a flower shop. Third joke here. Honestly, Georgian theatres might have been the original Yankee candle store. Today's scent, cinnamon roll courtier. But let's not forget the cost of this spectacle. Powder taxed your purse and your lungs. Some complained of coughing fits after evenings in heavily powdered rooms. Doctors debated whether wig powder was harmless dust or a health hazard. Historians still argue whether the respiratory complaints of the day were tied more to smoking chimneys or flour-fogged ballrooms. But either way, your lungs weren't exactly thriving. You drift further, picturing yourself leaning against a wall. Powdered haze glittering in the candlelight. Conversations muffled by the thickness of the air. Servants brush stray flour off shoulders, and somewhere in the corner, a mouse pokes its nose out from under a wig box, lured by the smell of pastry padding. It's not glamorous, but it's absurdly human. In the end, wigs were both ridiculous and essential. They showed rank, taste, and wealth, while doubling as portable bakeries balanced on fragile necks. And through it all, Georgian society danced on, sneezing, coughing, but never abandoning their perfumed towers of flour. The ballroom haze begins to thin in your imagination. And now you find yourself wandering into the streets of London, where powdered wigs are no longer just confined to aristocratic salons. Instead, they have become a kind of street-level status symbol, filtering down through society like trickle-down economics, except with more flour and fewer working benefits. The mainstream historical fact is that by the mid-18th century, wig powder was so popular that Britain imposed a tax on it in 1795. Officially called the powder tax, this law required anyone wishing to wear powdered hair to purchase a yearly certificate. The government figured, if people were determined to put half a bakery on their heads, they might as well pay for the privilege. Now for the quirky tidbit, the tax was calculated in a way that favoured clever workarounds. Some folks avoided it altogether by switching to simpler natural hairstyles. Others, unwilling to give up their pastry-scented clouds, resorted to secret powders made from cheaper substitutes. Rumour has it that ground rice, chalk, and even mashed potatoes were dusted onto wigs. That's right, you could basically season your hairstyle like a plate of shepherd's. Pie historians still argue whether the powder tax actually killed wig culture or whether wigs were already falling out of fashion thanks to changing tastes. What we do know is that within a generation, the fashion for heavy powdered wigs collapsed almost entirely. Like most fads, it burned bright, smelled strange, and then vanished, leaving people shaking their heads at what they once found stylish. Here comes joke number one. Imagine paying government tax just to smell like a croissant. That's dedication or madness. You walk down Fleet Street in your mind, picturing shop windows filled with little packets of perfume starch, each boasting different scents. Violet, rosemary, orange blossom. Wig dressers, yes, that was a profession, stood ready to apply powder with long bellows, puffing clouds so large they could choke a small dog if he wandered too close. Meanwhile, satirists sharpened their pens. Newspapers printed jokes about wig wearers being mistaken for pastry chefs. Caricature artists drew men with entire loaves of bread sprouting from their curls. One popular cartoon shows a mouse building a nest inside a powdered wig, captioned with the punchline, "No need for cheese, he's already in the bakery." Second joke slips in naturally here. If Georgian wigs were bakeries, you could say London had a donut problem. As you linger in this imagined London street, you hear ordinary people grumbling. Powder was expensive, time-consuming, and impractical. But for the wealthy, it was a non-negotiable signal of superiority. Even judges and barristers clung to their wigs long after fashion shifted, insisting that powdered hair symbolized impartiality. You can picture a courtroom where the defendant sneezes mid-trial, setting off a tiny flower cloud above the judge's head. And then comes the fringe detail. The powder wasn't always white. Sometimes it was tinted blue, lavender or pink. Yes, pastel wigs. Think of it as the Georgian equivalent of today's Instagram hair dye trends. Men might dust themselves in lavender powder to look sophisticated, while women could opt for pink highlights, signaling flirtatiousness without saying a word. Third joke, delivered softly. Imagine explaining to your grandparents that your bold new pink hair trend was, in fact, pioneered by powdered men in breeches. But not everything smelled like cupcakes. Some powders went rancid if stored too long. Servants complained of having to scrape caked flour off wigs after a damp evening. And occasionally, wig boxes, those big wooden chests where wigs were stored, attracted pests. Mice, beetles, and even cockroaches feasted on the starch and perfumes. Waking up to find your wig half-eaten wasn't just a nightmare. It was Tuesday. Historians still argue whether infestations were widespread or exaggerated by satirists, but the risk of pests living inside your hairpiece was real enough to make anyone itch. You stroll further along Fleet Street, hearing the faint sound of a street ballad, a mocking song about powdered noodles, who spent more time on their wigs than their wit. The humour of the day treated wigs as symbols of vanity, excess, and absurdity, even while half the population still wore them, and yet, despite all the ridicule, there's something strangely comforting about it all. A wig was more than a wig. It was armour, a bakery, a perfume bottle, and a political pamphlet all rolled into one. You picture yourself stepping into a shop, wig box under your arm, and the shopkeeper greeting you with white flour, lavender, or the house special, fresh-baked brioche scent. The absurdity makes you smile, but it also keeps you grounded in the world of powdered wigs, where even the air itself smelled like a patisserie gone slightly off. You step away from Fleet Street and wander into the drawing rooms and parlours, where wigs became not just fashion, but full-on conversation starters. If clothing was the Georgian language of status, then wigs were the exclamation points. You could announce your wealth, your politics, even your flirtatious mood, all without opening your mouth, provided your wig was piled high enough. The mainstream historical fact is that wigs, especially for women, could reach absurd heights in the late 18th century. Some hairstyles stretched over 3 feet tall, constructed with scaffolding, padding, and sometimes wire cages hidden beneath layers of powdered curls. Think of it as hair architecture, a skyline made of starch and perfume. Marie Antoinette herself famously wore towering creations, sometimes accessorized with miniature ships, gardens, or even mechanical birds that flapped their wings. Now for the quirky tidbit. Many of these elaborate wigs doubled as platforms for edible decorations. Yes, tiny sugar sculptures or marzipan fruits were occasionally perched among the curls. It was a bizarre fusion of haute couture and dessert buffet. Imagine walking into a salon, catching sight of a lady's wig, and realizing you could pluck a candied almond off it if you got hungry. It blurred the line between fashion and catering. Historians still argue whether these edible wigs were widespread or mostly exaggerated in satire. But contemporary accounts mention servants rushing to rescue decorative desserts before they slid down in the summer heat. And you thought balancing a hat was tricky. Try keeping a fruit tart from toppling while you curtsy. First joke sneaks in. Picture yourself at a party, craning your neck to whisper sweet nothings, only to get a cherry bonk you in the forehead. But it wasn't just edible delights. Scented powders turned wigs into olfactory experiences. Lavender or orange blossom might be romantic, but some wig wearers chose stranger aromas, like rosemary, a symbol of remembrance, or bergamot, sharp enough to mask body odor in a crowded room. Standing near a fashionable host, you'd feel like you were in a botanical garden that had exploded. The fringe detail that adds spice. Certain wigs were treated with powders mixed with ground musk or ambergris, the latter being a waxy substance produced in the intestines of sperm whales. Yes, you could literally wear whale guts as a fragrance enhancer. This little secret made wigs not just bakery scented, but ocean scented too, though most partygoers probably didn't know or didn't care. Second joke slides in gently. So technically, if your wig contained ambergris, you could claim to smell like whale but make it fashion. As you imagine yourself mingling in these powdery parlors, you notice how wigs influenced body language. With something so tall and delicate perched on your head, you couldn't just nod vigorously in agreement. Head movements became slower, more deliberate. A tilt of the wig could signal interest. A tiny shake might read as disdain. The wig turned your skull into a semaphore device, broadcasting signals across the ballroom. There's also the social anxiety factor. Wigs had to be maintained constantly. Powder clumped in damp weather. Sweat threatened to undo the starch. Servants carried powdering kits for emergency touch-ups, much like today's makeup bags. Imagine pulling your valet aside mid-dance to whisper, "Quick, my brioche is collapsing." Third joke here. If you've ever had a bad hair day, be grateful it didn't involve a 3-foot-tall sugar loaf and a risk of pigeons mistaking you for a bakery window. Historians still argue whether wigs empowered wearers by granting them exaggerated grandeur or whether they simply imprisoned people in ridiculous towers of vanity. But one thing is clear. Wigs shaped social interactions as much as they shaped foreheads. You lean back in your chair as this image settles. The parlor grows dim, candles flicker, and powdered figures glide past, smelling faintly of cakes and herbs. A gentleman bows with exaggerated care, his wig trembling like jelly on a plate. A lady leans toward you, her hairpiece bristling with sugared violets, and whispers gossip about who fainted last week when their wig caught fire from a candelabra. Yes, that happens sometimes. One careless swoop near an open flame, and suddenly your fashionable tower was a torch. So now, in your half-dreamy state, you picture a room shimmering with powdered heads, perfumed air thick as pudding, and wigs wobbling like precarious desserts at a banquet. It is absurd. It is elegant. It is history's strangest bakery. You shuffle from the glow of candlelit parlors into the cramped, bustling wigmakers' shops, where the real magic, and sometimes madness, happened. Behind every towering, pastry-scented contraption was a craftsman with nimble fingers, a cloud of powder in his lungs, and a mountain of animal hair waiting to be transformed. The mainstream historical fact: Georgian wigs were most often made from horsehair, yak hair, or human hair. Human hair fetched the highest prices, and some wig makers employed teams of women who went around buying cut hair directly from the poor. Locks from young women in rural villages were especially prized for their strength and shine. Horsehair, though cheaper, was coarse and itchy, so mixing the two became standard practice. The quirky tidbit: many wig makers also dealt in what they called dead men's hair. Grave robbing for hair was not as common as sensational pamphlets claimed. But wigs containing recycled funeral clippings weren't unheard of. Just imagine resting your head on a silk pillow while wearing a coiffure that once belonged to some long-forgotten gentleman who'd never given consent. It's creepy, but in the Georgian world, it was just commerce. Historians still argue whether the infamous corpse hair scandal of the 1770s was widespread reality or just a moral panic stirred up by newspapers looking for sales. Either way, the rumor alone was enough to make you scratch your head, literally and figuratively. Here comes your first joke. Nothing says sweet dreams like knowing your headpiece might have had a previous life, 6 feet under. The atmosphere inside a wig maker's shop was intense. Picture a room stacked with bundles of hair, flour barrels for powdering, pots of grease, and apprentices running around with scissors. The master wig maker would bark orders, stitching wefts of hair onto linen foundations, while clients peeked in to request something just like Lord So-and-so's latest. It was the fast fashion cycle of the 18th century. For a fringe detail, consider that many apprentices inhaled so much powder that their lungs turned chalky, leading to chronic coughs. Some accounts mention wig makers leaving handprints of flour on doorknobs or stair rails as though they'd been baking all day. And in a way, they had. Their ovens were just human skulls. Second joke fits naturally here. If you ever complain about glitter getting everywhere after one craft project, imagine flour, hair clippings, and whale-derived perfume ground into every pore of your skin. You continue the walk. The clatter of scissors fades, replaced by the softer rustle of bills being exchanged. Wigs weren't cheap. A finely made full-dress wig could cost more than a servant earned in a year. But wig makers offered rentals for those who wanted to look fancy for a single evening. That's right. You could rent a wig the way you might rent a tuxedo today. The catch? Shared wigs weren't always cleaned between uses. You don your borrowed bouffant and hope the last fellow didn't leave behind lice. Historians still argue whether these rented wigs helped spread lice epidemics or if hygiene was exaggerated in satire. But contemporary letters complain about crawling heads. So at least some customers ended up scratching furiously during card games. Third joke lands softly. If you think borrowing earbuds is gross, try borrowing an entire head of sweaty horsehair. Yet for all the chaos, wig makers enjoyed prestige. The top craftsmen received royal appointments. Their names appeared in newspapers, and they sometimes became fashion celebrities. Imagine being stopped on the street, not because you're wearing a famous wig, but because you built it. In some ways, wig makers were the influencers of their day, dictating what society thought was chic. As you drift further into this powder-choked shop, you can almost hear the faint clipping of scissors, the thud of hair bales being dropped onto tables, and the hissing exhale of an apprentice coughing into a sleeve. Somewhere, a gentleman waits impatiently, tapping his cane, eager for his new look. Somewhere else, a young woman from the countryside watches her freshly cut braid vanish into a pile, never knowing whose head it will crown, and you, with your imagination fogging, feel the wig maker gently measure your skull, muttering about ratios, powders, and curls. The smell of starch and musk fills your nose. For a brief moment, you can sense how fashion, labor, and faint absurdity collided in these workshops. It wasn't glamorous, but without these powder-dusted artisans, the Georgian world would never have smelled like pastries in the first place. You drift now from the cramped wig maker's shop into the bright, noisy streets of London. The carriages rattle, hawkers shout, and suddenly you notice something peculiar. Heads bobbing above the crowd like frosted cakes. These wigs aren't just ornaments. They're part of an elaborate language of class, status, and power. The mainstream historical fact. Wigs in the Georgian era were coded markers. The larger and more elaborate the wig, the wealthier or more important you appeared. Judges wore stiff, full-bottomed wigs with cascading curls to broadcast authority. Barristers had shorter ones, practical for long hours in stuffy courtrooms. Aristocrats donned elaborate confections dusted with powder, while merchants often chose plainer versions that said, "I'm successful but not ridiculous." The quirky tidbit. There were actually taxonomies of wigs, like a natural history of hairpieces. You had bob wigs, bag wigs, Q wigs, and even the hilariously named pigtails. Some were stuffed into silk bags tied with ribbons, while others trailed long braided queues down the back. There was a wig for mourning, a wig for weddings, and even campaign wigs designed for travelling, slightly sturdier for wind and mud. Historians still argue whether ordinary middle-class men embraced wigs wholeheartedly, or only begrudgingly. Diaries suggest some shopkeepers loved the prestige, while others moaned about the cost and inconvenience. Was the wig truly universal, or was it more of an upper-class obsession, trickling down only halfway? The debate lingers. Here comes your first joke. Imagine trying to pick the correct wig the way you pick sneakers today. Do you go with the sleek court bob for business, or the flashy Ramillies if you're feeling extra? Wigs also played a role in signalling politics. During the early 18th century, Whigs and Tories mocked one another's hairstyles in satirical prints. One cartoon showed a politician's wig collapsing under the weight of its curls, implying he was all style and no substance. The hair became shorthand for arguments about corruption, loyalty, and class snobbery. But not all wig language was noble. Some styles earned nicknames that stuck for decades. The scratch wig, a quick and cheap model, became synonymous with lower class or slightly disreputable types. To wear a scratch wig was almost like admitting you'd bought your suit off the discount rack. Second joke slips in. Scratch wigs were basically the fast food of hair. Cheap, greasy, and guaranteed to leave you unsatisfied after an hour. Women, too, sent messages through wigs and towering coiffures. A lady's enormous powdered hairdo might feature miniature ships, bird cages, or gardens woven into the curls. These displays told guests not just of her wealth, but of her wit. The higher the poof, the higher her place in society, or at least her ambitions. Historians still argue whether women's elaborate headpieces were empowering statements or imprisoning burdens. Some scholars see them as playful acts of creativity, while others emphasize how rigid expectations forced women into wearing literal architectural structures on their heads. Maybe, as with most fashion, it was both. You picture yourself strolling through St. James's Park. Ahead, a gentleman tips his wig politely. Across the way, a woman towers a full 2 feet taller thanks to her coiffure. In the candlelit evening, their shadows stretch long and absurd across the gravel path. You can almost hear whispers. That's a full bottom. He must be a judge. Or, that poof is magnificent. Surely she dines with the Duchess. Third joke lands here. In a way, Georgian wigs were like early Wi-Fi signals. You didn't need to talk to know how strong someone's connection was. And if you ever doubted the language of wigs, just look at portraits. Painters exaggerated curls, brightened powders, and enlarged headpieces because patrons wanted their status written in hair. To shrink a wig in paint was an insult. Better to overdo it than risk your sitter looking like an underdressed clerk. The social meaning wasn't only about grandeur, it was also about trust. A bald head without a wig might be read as sloppy, disrespectful, or even dishonest. In courts and business meetings, to appear bareheaded was to risk ridicule. By contrast, a well-chosen wig whispered reliability, sophistication, and belonging. And so, as you wander among powdered heads and bobbing curls, you feel the pressure too. Which wig would you choose? A discreet bob that lets you blend in, or a lavish full-bottomed confection that screams authority? Either way, the hair on your head, whether yours or not, tells the world exactly who you are. The streets fade behind you, and now you find yourself stepping into a grand Georgian ballroom. Candles drip from gilded chandeliers, violins hum in the gallery, and everywhere you look, powdered wigs shimmer under the golden light. Tonight, we lean in close to the rituals and choreography that wigs demanded in social life. The mainstream historical fact: Georgian high society treated wigs as tickets of admission. Without one, you were underdressed, even scandalous. Invitations to assemblies, balls, or private salons often implied the wig was as mandatory as your breeches. Gentlemen refreshed their powder before stepping into the crowd, and ladies had their towering coiffures adjusted by nimble-fingered servants at the last minute. The quirky tidbit: powder rooms weren't originally about makeup. They were literal chambers where men ducked in to repowder their wigs. You can picture it, row after row of gentlemen emerging with snowy crowns, sneezing violently because starch and perfume had just been blasted in their faces. Those tiny chambers gave birth to the term powder room that we still use today for restrooms. Imagine your surprise if you wandered in expecting privacy and found a dozen powdered gentlemen furiously patting their curls. Historians still argue whether these wig rituals genuinely unified high society or only created stricter barriers. On one hand, everyone, from dukes to wealthy bankers, wore them, which smoothed class differences. On the other, the cost of maintenance and powder pushed middle-class families to the financial brink. Were wigs democratizing or elitist? You'll hear both theories. Now for joke one, honestly, if you've ever been embarrassed by bedhead, imagine needing a support staff just to make your hair socially acceptable. The ballroom scene isn't only about the wig, it's about movement. Women's towering hairstyles risked collision as they curtsied. Men's cues sometimes brushed strangers' shoulders during a dance. Satirists had a field day mocking these mishaps, sketching cartoons where two ladies couldn't bow without their hair tangling, or where a gentleman's wig slipped mid-minuet, landing squarely in the punch bowl. Second joke. You thought dropping your phone at a party was bad? Try fishing your wig out of sangria. Perfume played a starring role here. Wigs weren't just doused with powder, but also with lavender, orange blossom, or bergamot. At a crowded gathering, this created an overwhelming haze, a sugary cloud that mixed with the smell of candles and sweat. Some guests claimed the effect was intoxicating, while others muttered that you could choke before dessert. The rituals even extended into conversation. A man might flick his curls just so, to display the fullness of his wig, or pat it down, signaling composure. Women occasionally perch small trinkets, miniature figurines or feathers, inside their hair as conversation starters. Picture someone pointing at your head instead of asking about the weather. Oh, is that a porcelain shepherd in your poof? How charming. Historians still argue whether women themselves enjoyed these flourishes or if they endured them under pressure. Were those miniature ships a sign of playful satire, or were they forced performances of wealth? The answer shifts depending on which letters or memoirs you read. Third joke. Honestly, if you've ever balanced sunglasses on your head and forgotten they're there, imagine doing that with a foot-tall frigate ship. The rituals of wigs extended far beyond the ballroom too. At coffee houses, men laid their wigs on stands while sipping news and gossip, carefully patting them back into place before departure. In the theatre, you might borrow powder from a friend mid-act to fix a wilted curl. Even at church, parishioners sat with stiff necks so as not to dislodge the powder onto their neighbours' shoulders. Through it all, wigs became a performance. Each interaction, each bow, each powdered sneeze contributed to a choreography that defined the Georgian age. You can almost hear the rustle of silk gowns, the scuff of polished shoes, and the faint, ever-present hiss of powdered starch floating in candlelight. And there you stand, awkwardly patting your own wig. Is it slipping? Is the powder uneven? Will anyone notice? Of course they will. That's the point. In this powdered world, your hair doesn't just sit on your head. It speaks, it performs, it declares, and if it makes you sneeze, well, that's simply part of the show. You drift out of the ballroom, still brushing stray powder from your coat, and soon find yourself outdoors in the chilly Georgian night. Torches sputter, carriages line the streets, and everyone is still fussing with their wigs. Tonight, we step into the economics, the dizzying costs that wigs demanded, and the curious lengths people went to in order to afford them. The mainstream historical fact: wigs in the Georgian era were status symbols, but they weren't cheap. A gentleman's wig could cost the equivalent of several weeks' wages for a servant. High-quality hair, often imported from France or Italy, was particularly costly. Maintaining it meant visits to wig makers, purchases of powder, pomade, ribbons, and regular cleaning. For some families, wig expenses were as unavoidable as rent or bread. The quirky tidbit: some thrifty wig wearers recycled old wigs by turning them inside out. Yes, wig makers sometimes stitched the fresher strands of hair inward, flipping them around so the ragged ends faced the scalp, buying you a few more weeks before total embarrassment. You can imagine the awkward conversations when someone leaned too close and noticed your hair looked suspiciously like a reversed mop. Historians still argue whether the wig trade genuinely boosted the economy or drained it. On one hand, wig makers, barbers, and perfumers thrived. On the other, families spent extravagantly just to keep up appearances, funneling money away from necessities. Was this economic stimulation or just a powdered money pit? No consensus exists. First joke, think of it like buying the latest smartphone every year, except it sits on your head and smells like vanilla. There were also taxes. In Britain, the government sniffed profit and imposed duties on wig powder. Imagine paying extra just to sneeze in style. Critics mocked this as absurd, but the Crown collected steady revenue from fashionable foreheads. The tax even shaped styles. Some people trimmed their wigs smaller to use less powder, accidentally kick-starting new trends. Meanwhile, the supply chain for wigs was global. Human hair often came from poorer communities in rural Europe, where women sold their locks to wig makers. One woman's desperate sale in Naples or Warsaw might end up adorning a London lawyer. For horsehair wigs, entire markets cropped up around equestrian grooming, with tails trimmed and shipped for fashion. The economics stretched across borders, carrying with them invisible stories of poverty, necessity, and vanity. Second joke, if you've ever blamed a bad haircut on your barber, imagine realizing your curls were once a Hungarian donkey's tail. Because of the costs, counterfeits abounded. Some wig makers secretly mixed horsehair with human hair but still charged full price. Others dyed rat fur or goat hair to pass it off as luxurious strands. Buyers grumbled. But unless you had a magnifying glass, who could tell? This shadow market blurred class lines further. You could look like a duke on a farmer's budget, provided no one tugged too hard at your curls. Historians still argue whether ordinary people despised wigs for their expense or envied them too much to care. Satirical pamphlets poke fun at both. The poor mocked the rich for wasting money, while also saving up to buy shabbier versions themselves. The wig craze spread downward through society like a contagious sneeze. Third joke, and you thought fast fashion was new. Georgians basically had shine, but powdered. Wealthy patrons often flaunted their expenses, boasting about paying outrageous sums for wig upkeep. Diaries mention the ruinous costs of pomade, yet people persisted. Why? Because wigs weren't just about hair. They were walking investments in reputation. Showing up without one could harm your career, your marriage prospects, even your credit. The economics even tied into crime. Wig theft became common, with pickpockets snatching wigs off heads in crowded streets. Stolen wigs were resold in shadowy corners, sometimes back to wig makers who discreetly refurbished them. You might walk into a shop and unknowingly buy your own wig back, freshly powdered. So here you stand, clutching your expensive curls like a nervous investor, wondering if you should insure it. Your wig is a bank account, a billboard, and a sneeze-inducing liability all rolled into one. But as absurd as it seems, you can't escape the truth. In the Georgian world, money doesn't just talk, it powder puffs. The night drifts on, and you wander away from the bustling Georgian streets into the quieter corners of society, where wigs became more than fashion. They became identity. Tonight we'll stroll through the world of gender roles and how wigs shaped expectations of men and women, while sometimes being gleefully subverted. The mainstream historical fact is that wigs were primarily a male accessory in the Georgian period, though women certainly dabbled in powdered coiffures. Men's wigs, periwigs, queue wigs, bob wigs dominated courtrooms, parliament, and ballrooms. They symbolized authority, stability, and respectability. Judges, barristers, and even clerks wore them as professional armor. Women, meanwhile, had their own towering hairstyles, often their natural hair enhanced with pads, powder, and ornaments. Yet both shared the same obsession with whiteness. The snowy look implied youth, wealth, and refinement. The quirky tidbit: some women wore false fronts, essentially wiglets clipped to their hairline to exaggerate their bouffant. One satirical cartoon shows a lady fainting dramatically because her wiglet was too heavy, and a maid rushing forward not to catch her mistress, but to rescue the wig before it toppled. For women, wigs were half vanity, half hazard. Historians still argue whether women embraced wigs out of genuine fashion desire or as resistance to male-dominated norms. Did wearing elaborate hairpieces give them power in social spaces, or did it trap them in expectations of decoration? The debate continues, with pamphlets and portraits suggesting both interpretations. First joke: it's like arguing if high heels are empowering or just foot torture. Georgians had the same problem, but with scalp cramps. Gender bending, though, was also a quiet subculture. Theatrical performers often crossed lines, with men donning women's wigs for comic roles. and women wearing shorter wigs to play breeches parts. Audiences laughed, but the performance blurred rules of propriety. In some urban masquerades, disguises allowed women to wear men's wigs freely, a playful rebellion against rigid expectations. Meanwhile, certain professions blurred gender wig rules. Female servants sometimes borrowed their master's old wigs for special occasions, cutting them down to size. You can imagine the odd spectacle of a maid wearing a powder-dusted miniature periwig to a Sunday stroll. Second joke. Picture borrowing your boss's old company uniform, except the uniform was his sweaty hairpiece. Romantic, isn't it? For men, wigs had to convey seriousness, but different styles conveyed different messages. A short bob wig marked you as a young man of fashion. A longer, fuller style meant wisdom. Judges wore traditional curled wigs even when fashions shifted, clinging to authority through hair. That tradition still lingers today in British courts. Women, on the other hand, often weaponized hair height. The taller the hairstyle, the greater the implied influence. Caricatures show women's coiffures scraping ceilings, decorated with ships, birds, even miniature gardens. Men mocked it as absurd excess, but women kept doing it, because every inch added to their power in a society where few avenues of authority existed. Historians still argue whether the obsession with height was satire exaggerated by cartoonists or a genuine practice. Surviving fashion magazines suggest it really did happen. Ladies recorded sleeping propped upright on pillows so their towering hairdos wouldn't collapse overnight. Imagine dozing off like a doll, neck aching, all for the sake of powder. Third joke. Honestly, it makes today's bedhead look like a luxury spa treatment. Gender dynamics also seeped into law. Inheritance disputes occasionally mentioned wigs as part of wardrobes. Yes, wills recorded, "one brown wig to my nephew." A strange reminder that even after death, a wig retained value. Some widows wore their husbands' wigs as mourning, a bizarre blend of grief and thrift. And then there were moral critiques. Preachers railed against wigs, calling them sinful vanities that confused natural roles. One sermon declared wigs were Satan's mask upon the head, which might have scared a few listeners, though probably not enough to stop powdering before service. So, you sit here, watching men and women powder alike, both locked in battles of identity. Wigs were supposed to clarify status, but ended up muddying boundaries. Male, female, rich, poor, serious, frivolous. They raise questions still debated centuries later, and if you think that's complicated, wait until you see what happens when politics enters the powder bowl. You leave behind the private boudoir and noisy theatres, stepping into the charged air of political salons and royal courts. Powder, curls, and wigs were no longer just tools of personal identity. They became tools of propaganda. Tonight, you find yourself listening in as wigs whisper loyalties, rivalries, and even treason. The mainstream historical fact: wigs were overtly political during the Georgian era. Different cuts and powder styles were associated with particular factions. Whigs and Tories, the two great political rivals, cultivated slightly different tastes. One satirical poet claimed you could identify a man's politics by the angle of his wig's curls, though perhaps that was wishful thinking. The quirky tidbit. Some men deliberately wore unfashionable wigs as a sign of political stubbornness. Imagine strutting around in last decade's style, just to prove you weren't a mindless follower of the opposition. One London diarist even notes that a certain lord's refusal to trim his outdated periwig was read as an act of defiance against the ruling ministry. Essentially, wig as political billboard. Historians still argue whether these associations were consciously cultivated or mostly exaggerated by satirical prints. Were people really reading curls as manifestos, or were caricaturists just having a laugh? Evidence suggests both. A wig might not topple governments, but in a society obsessed with surfaces, it certainly nudged impressions. First joke. It's like wearing a red tie or blue tie today, except instead of silk, you're sweating under half a sheep on your head. Wigs also reflected the monarchy's image. George I and George II, both of German Hanoverian descent, leaned into wigs as symbols of continuity with English tradition. By contrast, George III, later nicknamed Farmer George, sometimes preferred simpler styles, giving him a more down-to-earth image. His more modest wigs fueled his public persona as a man of the people, even if the people still couldn't afford powdered starch every week. At court events, wig styles were practically mandated. To show up underdressed was political suicide. Ambassadors arriving in unpowdered wigs were mocked in dispatches back home. proof that diplomacy could collapse over hair. One French envoy complained bitterly that his English hosts used more flour on their heads than on their bread. Second joke, honestly, if you've ever had a bad hair day ruin your confidence, imagine it tanking an international treaty. Pamphlets and satirical prints weaponized wigs to lampoon enemies. A popular cartoon depicted a politician's wig infested with rats labeled with corrupt deals. Another mocked a reformer's short, plain wig as poverty in curls. Hair, it seemed, was free ammunition. Even revolutions found wig symbolism useful. During the American Revolution, loyalists were sneered at as powdered fools, clinging to aristocratic airs while colonists went wigless in defiance. Benjamin Franklin, famously plain in dress, avoided elaborate wigs altogether, cultivating the image of rustic simplicity. His natural hair, what little of it he had, became almost a brand, standing in contrast to powdered British counterparts. Historians still argue whether Franklin's wigless look was deliberate propaganda or just comfort. After all, it's easier to campaign for independence without a cloud of starch in your lungs. But either way, the symbolism stuck. Women's hair also entered political games. During the French Revolution across the Channel, British women adopted towering patriot styles, while caricaturists drew wigs collapsing under the weight of political slogans literally perched atop them. Imagine balancing a model of a liberty cap above your curls while pretending you're only there for the gossip. Third joke. Try wearing your political opinions on your head. Twitter hat, anyone? Back in England, wigs also defined professional politics. Judges, MPs and lawyers kept their wigs long after fashionable society abandoned them, precisely because they conveyed stability. To this day, British judges still wear them, frozen in time like powdered fossils of political history. So, as you watch powdered heads bow in Parliament, you realise wigs were never neutral. Every curl, every puff of starch was a signal, sometimes subtle, sometimes loud. They might have looked like harmless pastry towers, but they carried the weight of thrones, revolutions, and reputations. And just when you think it's all about politics, the economy barges in. Flour, starch, and even wig makers themselves formed an entire industry that kept the curls standing. And tomorrow you'll walk into that marketplace. You wander from the echoing chambers of Parliament into the bustling, flour-dusted backstreets of Georgian London, where the wig economy whirs like a hidden machine. Behind every powdered head in Westminster, or every towering coiffure at a ball, there's an army of merchants, apprentices, and hawkers keeping the curls upright. Tonight, you slip into their world. The mainstream historical fact: wig making was big business. By the mid-18th century, London alone boasted thousands of barbers and peruke makers. They operated in small shops, often marked with wooden wig signs dangling above the door. Each one offered a dizzying menu: bob wigs, Q wigs, tie wigs, clerical wigs, full-bottomed wigs. It was like walking into a pastry shop where everything was made of hair, the quirky tidbit. Wig makers didn't just rely on human hair. They used yak hair from Tibet, horsehair, goat hair, and sometimes even threads of silk. This meant the global trade in wigs tied into colonial roots. You might be wearing a little piece of Mongolian yak on your head while sipping tea from China. Talk about global fashion. Historians still argue whether human hair was more prized than animal substitutes. Advertisements claimed real hair wigs commanded higher prices, but accounts survive of wealthy clients demanding horsehair because it held its curl better. It seems authenticity wasn't always the selling point. First joke. You can almost hear someone bragging, "Oh, this? Genuine Bavarian goat. Very exclusive." Apprenticeship in wig making could last 7 years. Young boys learned to boil hair, bleach it, and weave it into carefully knotted lace foundations. Their hands developed the fine dexterity of lace makers, and their lungs, unfortunately, the dust of flour and powder. Some apprentices even slept under the shop bench, their lives tied to curls and starch from dawn to dusk. Then there were the itinerant wig powderers, trudging from house to house carrying bellows, powder, and perfumed oils. They were like Georgian-era Uber stylists, except you paid them in shillings and maybe stale bread. They'd dust you up in the morning before a court date or dinner party, and off you went, smelling faintly like almond cake. Second joke. Imagine the Yelp reviews. Arrived late, overpowdered my curls, now pigeons keep pecking at my head. 2 stars. The supply chain for flour and starch tied wigs directly to bakeries and mills. When a poor harvest struck in the 1770s, bread riots erupted in England. Bakers were attacked, accused of selling to wig makers instead of starving families. Pamphlets mocked powdered aristocrats as eating the poor man's bread with their hair. That's one reason the government later taxed hair powder in 1795. It wasn't just revenue, it was damage control. Historians still argue whether the wig trade genuinely worsened food shortages, or whether it was mostly symbolic scapegoating. Either way, wigs became visible targets when hunger gnawed at bellies. Beyond economics, wig shops doubled as social hubs. Gentlemen lingered in chairs as barbers shaved, powdered, and gossiped. Political news circulated faster there than in the press. A satirical poem even described wig shops as parliaments of powder, where opinions flew as freely as flour dust. Wig makers themselves organized into guilds, defending their craft from imposters. Rivalries with ordinary barbers sometimes turned violent. One report describes a brawl between wig apprentices and barber apprentices, both sides armed with curling irons and scissors, clashing in the streets like medieval guild militias, but much better groomed. Third joke. If you thought gang wars were scary, imagine one fought with combs and hairspray. The economy rippled outward too. Perfumers thrived selling oils to soften wigs. Laundresses made extra money washing wig linens. Even coffin makers found wig wearers demanding their favourite curls be preserved for burial. Eternal style statements. And behind the glamour, a darker truth lingered. The hair trade could be exploitative. Some human hair was bought from impoverished women, others stolen from corpses or bartered from servants. The ethics of the wig trade were as tangled as the curls themselves. So, as you watch apprentices knot horsehair under flickering candlelight, and powder clouds billow from the bellows of a travelling stylist, you realise wigs weren't just fashion, they were an industry, a livelihood, and sometimes a scandal. And just beyond the marketplace, critics waited with sharpened quills, ready to mock and dismantle this powdered empire. Tomorrow you'll slip into the satire and scandal of wig culture. You drift from the wig makers' stalls into the echoing chambers of satire, where Georgian pens dripped ink sharper than any barber's razor. Tonight you ease into a world of cartoons, pamphlets, and gossip, where powdered curls became not just fashion, but fodder for mockery. The mainstream historical fact, wig wearing, became so entrenched in elite culture that it was irresistible to satirists. Publications like The Tatler and The Spectator regularly poked fun at the absurdities of fashion. Caricaturists such as James Gilray and Thomas Rowlandson immortalized bloated judges, foppish courtiers, and puffed-up dandies, all wearing wigs so oversized they seemed ready to topple. The quirky tidbit. Some pamphlets claimed wigs actually caused moral decay. An anonymous 1760 broadside declared that powder clouds the conscience as it clouds the hair, arguing that vanity in wigs led to deceit in politics and adultery in marriage. It's essentially the 18th century equivalent of blaming video games for society's downfall. Historians still argue whether wigs were truly viewed as political, symbols of decadence, or simply easy targets for satire. Some scholars see them as shorthand for corruption and excess, while others insist cartoons exaggerated their importance because, well, they were just visually funny. First joke. Imagine today's political cartoons, except instead of drawing oversized noses, everyone's head is buried under 3 feet of yak hair. In London coffeehouses, conversations about wigs often turned heated. Pamphleteers accused the elite of wasting flour while the poor starved. Others ridiculed the sheer impracticality. Wigs toppling in windstorms, powder streaking down one's coat during rain, curls catching fire near candles. You might survive political scandal, but one careless lean toward a candelabra could turn you into flambé. Second joke. You picture a gentleman fleeing a dinner party, wig ablaze, yelling, "Fetch the pudding, we'll smother it." There was also a gendered edge to the satire. Women's towering hairstyles, although technically not wigs, but elaborate constructions of natural hair augmented with pads, were mocked relentlessly. Pamphlets described them as nests for mice, birds, or even small pets. Men's wigs, by contrast, symbolized pompous authority, lawyers wagging curls in court, bishops powdered to heavenly heights. Satirists gleefully punctured both images, scribbling cartoons that turned curls into cages or crowns of folly. Historians still argue whether the satire changed behavior. Some evidence suggests it did. Aristocrats quietly trimmed down their styles in the face of mockery. Others say ridicule only hardened elite resolve, reinforcing wigs as symbols of untouchable privilege. Critics also tied wigs to shifting ideas of masculinity. Where once natural hair symbolized rugged virility, wigs signaled artificiality, polish, and theatricality. Satirists painted wig wearers as effete macaronis, men so consumed with appearance they seemed foreign, feminized, or ridiculous. The word macaroni itself, borrowed from Italians, became slang for someone overdressed. You can almost hear the sneer. Look at him, strutting like a plate of pasta. Third joke. Somewhere out there, a Georgian stand-up comedian probably did a 5-minute set entirely on wig jokes. Political cartoons often tied wigs directly to corruption. Gilray's prints showed powdered politicians whispering conspiracies, curls forming serpentine shapes that wrapped around scheming faces. Wigs weren't just hair, they were props in a theatre of power, puffed with flower and irony. Meanwhile, in polite society, fashion manuals scolded readers against excess. Writers warned that too much powder made one look like a clown. A 1780 satire even suggested wigs had absorbed the nation's dignity like a sponge soaks gin. Subtle, they were not. And then came theatre. Actors in comedies exaggerated wigs to absurd proportions, playing foppish characters whose curls bounced with every foolish line. Audiences roared with laughter, recognizing real figures hidden beneath powdered caricatures. The stage became another mirror, magnifying the ridiculousness of wigs until the laughter stuck. So, as you sit by a flickering candle, pamphlets spread on the table, you realize wigs were not just fashion. They were conversation, controversy, comedy. They puffed up heads. Yes, but also puffed up debates. And in the years ahead, when revolutions rattled Europe and bread riots shook England, satire gave way to legislation. The powdered empire would face its final reckoning in law and tax. Tomorrow, you'll step into that courtroom of history. The candlelight flickers low, and you shuffle forward into the closing act of the wig saga. Taxation, decline, and the slow fade into history. By now, you've walked through streets powdered white, sniffed wigs that smelled like cakes, endured critiques from satirists, and even laughed at wigs catching fire. But now, you arrive at the moment when society finally decided, enough. The mainstream historical fact, by the late 18th century, powdered wigs had lost their luster. The Napoleonic Wars disrupted supplies of flour and starch, and governments grew hungry for revenue. In Britain, Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger introduced the infamous hair powder tax of 1795. Each person who wanted to keep wearing powder had to pay a guinea a year, a hefty sum at the time. Suddenly, fashion became not just ridiculous but expensive. The quirky tidbit. People staged protests by refusing the powder tax, proudly calling themselves natural heads. Imagine it, a movement of men strutting the streets bare-haired, declaring freedom from flour. Some wore medallions engraved with slogans like "No tax on hair." Essentially, Georgian-era punk rock. Historians still argue whether the tax truly killed the wig, or whether broader cultural shifts had already doomed it. After all, the French Revolution had already turned powdered heads into symbols of aristocratic excess. When heads literally rolled in Paris, hair fashion seemed less amusing. First joke. Nothing like the threat of guillotines to make you rethink your hairstyle choices. By the early 1800s, wigs retreated to ceremonial corners. Judges, barristers, and a handful of clergy kept them as professional uniforms. Soldiers abandoned them for practical short-cropped hair. Ordinary men increasingly followed suit. The natural head movement wasn't just about saving a guinea, it was about rejecting the powdered pretensions of the past. Second joke. You picture a Georgian teenager rolling their eyes at dad's wig. Ugh, so old-fashioned. Just grow your own hair, man. Even women, whose towering coiffures had once dominated gossip, turned towards simpler, classical styles inspired by Greece and Rome. Hair was now styled in buns, waves or curls closer to the scalp with far less powder. Fashion's pendulum had swung from excess to restraint. Satire had played its part, but so had practicality. Powder was messy, wigs were expensive. Hair, on the other hand, grew for free. You can almost hear a Georgian housemaid sighing in relief. Fewer wigs to dust, less powder coating the furniture, more time to sleep. Third joke. Finally, The dog could nap on the floor without waking up covered in starch. And yet wigs never truly disappeared. In Britain and its former colonies, they lingered in courts of law, where tradition clung as stubbornly as flour to velvet. Judges still don wigs today, their white curls bobbing like relics of another age. In ceremonies, the powdered head remains a symbol of solemn authority, even if most people now chuckle at its absurdity. Historians still argue whether wigs' decline was inevitable, or whether some alternate timeline might have kept them alive. Imagine a world where every banker, politician, and movie star still wore powdered curls. The Oscars, but with white wigs. Super Bowl halftime shows with performers balancing towers of hair. Tempting, isn't it? And so, you sit back, the wig saga complete. You've seen its rise, its glory, its ridicule, and its fall. You've smelled its sweetness, heard its satire, and felt the flour sift through your fingers. From barbers' stalls to Parliament's taxes, wigs have drifted through every corner of Georgian life. Now the room grows quieter. The powdered air settles. You lean into your pillow, imagining the last curls collapsing into dust, leaving only stories behind. The wigs are gone, but their whispers remain. And now, as we close this long, powdered journey, let yourself soften into the quiet. Picture the streets of London emptying out after dusk, the powdery haze dispersing into the cool night air. The clatter of carriage wheels fades, the tavern chatter dims, and only the faint rustle of wigs being set aside for the evening lingers in your imagination. Your breathing steadies, like the hush after laughter in a theatre, when the curtain falls and only the glow of candles remains. Those curls, those absurd constructions, those flower-dusted fashions, they have had their moment. Like so many things in history, they arrived with fanfare, lingered with stubborn pride, and finally yielded to the weight of time. Tonight, you've walked through alleys of wig makers, brushed shoulders with satirists, smelled the strange sweetness of flour and orange water, and even caught glimpses of flames dancing too close to powder. You've seen ridicule, reverence, and rebellion all woven through strands of hair, real and false alike. And with each step, you've let the noise of the past soften into something almost soothing. So let your mind unclench now. Let the imagery fade into a gentle blur. The wigs are tucked away, the powder washed out, the jokes folded into memory. What remains is only calm, the soft rise and fall of your breath, the weight of your blanket, the steady rhythm of sleep calling you closer. The past is done. The wigs are gone. You are here, safe, at rest. And as you drift deeper, just remember, history doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it can be as quiet as powdered air in a candlelit room.